Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me for our weekly chat on geopolitics and markets is Rob Larity. We usually post these on Fridays. We're publishing this on Saturday. We will have some content for you next week, but it's pre-recorded. I'm off the grid next week. I will catch up with you the week after that. Email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to talk about our research offerings, our advisory offerings, our wealth management offerings, or just about anything else that's on your mind. I'm happy to have your thoughts. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. That does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Rob, good to see you. You've been traveling all over the place. Did you hear about the guy or the U.S. soldier in South Korea who was arrested for assault or something like that, and they were shipping him back on the airplane? And apparently at the airport, he ran away or something like that and went on a tour of the DMZ and then just made a run for it into North Korea, into the waiting arms of the North Korean security services. Like they had the U.S. military police and the South Korean security guys. This is according to the Reuters official witness account, running after him, but he got too far across the line and they didn't want to go and all those other things. And apparently he's been arrested by North Korea. How bad do things have to be in your life that you are defecting to North Korea? That's the first for me. I don't know. I just wanted to start with that because wow, some weeks, the intro just presents itself to me, you know?
I'm speechless. I have nothing to add on that story other than shock.
Yeah. If he ever gets out of both North Korean jail and then whatever jail he's going to be in the U.S. for whatever else he did, man, that's a book or a podcast right there for him. Aside from that, so you escaped from Paris to Dublin, not exactly South Korea to North Korea, but I thought we'd start with some of your reflections on what you saw in Ireland from walking the streets of Dublin, if you remember after your pints of Guinness, what you thought in the moment that was so brilliant.
Well, it's funny from an analytical standpoint. It's just objectively true that the Guinness tastes better in Ireland. But the funny thing is, if you ask everyone why, they're all certain that they know why, and all of their theories are completely different. So I asked one guy why. He said, "Oh, it's because their turnover in the pipes is much faster, so it doesn't build up. So it's a lot fresher. Look at how it's sticking to the glass." And he had a real description of that. Then I asked another guy, and he said, "Oh, it's because of the water. We don't have this kind of water, and they have this water everywhere else. It's natural reservoirs and blah blah blah." So there's a lot of myths flying around about why the Guinness is so good, and I'm not sure they've nailed that one down yet. But we'll have to do some more research and see how that goes.
A lot of field research coming your way, I can tell.
Ireland. Why is Ireland interesting? Ireland is in our strategic wealth strategy one of the highest overweight countries that we have. So when we're allocating clients' wealth across the world, that is in the bucket where we want to have as much exposure long term as possible. And for those who are interested, Jacob wrote an in-focus piece on the geopolitics of Ireland, which really focused a lot on demographics, the relationship with the EU, which you can download for free on our website. We offer it as a free sample of our research, so you can find more stuff there if you're interested. But why is Ireland interesting? For a number of reasons. There are interesting migration patterns going on, which we'll talk about in a minute. There are real estate questions that are very interesting to pick through, both on the commercial real estate side and on the residential real estate side. And from a services standpoint, Ireland is emerging as a major technology hub, and you can just see it. You can see the people there. It has a similar feel to Boston, a similar feel to Cambridge in some ways. Not quite, at the same level, but as far as its cosmopolitan nature, like the sort of way people are talking, what they're focused on, it's trending in that direction. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. First, on the real estate side, the biggest topic in Ireland is the housing shortage. And this is the most fascinating puzzle right now because there's a residential housing shortage. I was last there in October. It was very bad. From all of the field work that I did this time, and just to like clarify what that is. So I just walked around and I talked to construction workers, Brazilians, people in the LinkedIn headquarters. You just wander around, and Ireland is like, from a fieldwork perspective, if fieldwork is like a video game, Ireland is the tutorial, because everyone's so friendly. They'll all talk to you. Like you go to some places, it's very hard to get people to open their mouths. Here, people don't shut up. You just kind of give them an intro and they tell you their thoughts about everything. So it's pretty easy to get a lot of information in Ireland. But where was I going with this? Oh, on the real estate. So the housing issue is getting much worse. And housing prices are absolutely through the roof. So just to put that into context, I spoke with some people who said that there are people who are sharing a 2-bedroom or a 1-bedroom apartment, 3 people in 1 bedroom in bunk beds. Each of them is paying €1,000 per month, and not in downtown Dublin, not in a fancy part of the city, like 20 minutes north of the city. Like it's reaching almost emergency level prices and shortages. The part of the reason why that's happening is because of the migration. So when I was there in October, the feeling was, because as we've mentioned before, there's about, I think 60,000 Ukrainians that have gone to Ireland. Mm-hmm. And Ireland has really stood out relative to the rest of the EU in terms of its willingness to accept refugees and migrants of all types. So when I was there in October, the feeling toward the Ukrainians, who have been, by the way, put up in hotels because there's physically nowhere else to put them, the feeling back then was mixed, generally positive. Yeah, we feel bad for you guys, what's happening in your country. This time, much less positive. Very obvious. People are fed up with having the Ukrainians there, and they're fed up with the government's sort of programs that they've implemented, because they're letting them live there for free. And a lot of these people are now working, so they're taking home their take-home pay. They have no rent. So imagine the resentments that come when you're paying through the nose for your rent, and someone who's a refugee, but they're a well-educated professional person, is there working and not paying anything. So that's a very noteworthy change. And there's also evidence that refugees from other countries are really starting to show up there. So some people are starting to complain about Nigerians coming to the country. Now, Nigeria, arguably speaking, is not a failed state that needs refugees. There's no war. In the north of the country there is, but there
are parts of Nigeria that might qualify.
There are, but when I tell you this story, you're gonna sort of see that there's a little bit of a scam going on, because I read an article. There's a tent city emerging in the center of Dublin. This was one of the main things in the news, because refugees, they have no physical place to go, right? As I mentioned, so they're just living in tents in front of the refugee welcome center, hundreds of people. And someone burned down the tent city like a month ago, but I was reading an article where a journalist was interviewing the people who were living in this thing. And they interviewed one of the guys who's a Brazilian guy. And they said, "Oh, why are you a refugee here?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, things in Brazil are just really, really bad politically right now. So I'm a political refugee." So, which obviously is bullshit. So
yeah, although to stop you there, what's not bullshit? We had Sim on last week or the week before, and he was talking about the Sahel. And when you cruise through the news of these countries, whether it's Burkina Faso or Niger, hundreds of people getting killed every week, and jihadist attacks and migrants moving all over the place. Sudan's civil war getting worse by the week. The UN said 250,000 people displaced just in the last week alone. Ethiopia's civil war only just ended, and they're still having problems. You already mentioned Nigeria. The DRC is heading into election season, and the UN also said this week that they're 40 new people dead in some attack 12 miles north of Goma, and that they're getting new migration flows there as well. So, when we think about migration flows to the European Union, I'm not sure we've even approached the beginning of this, because Europe is the place that is going to face the most pressure from some of these flows upward. But
absolutely,
keep going.
Absolutely,
I'd throw that in there.
And I don't mean to downplay it, because obviously there are legitimate refugees in that group. It's just kind of funny that the Brazilian and some others were in there basically riding their coattails. But it is, I mean, the broader point here is, I think that's right. Migration flows are going to go up. And I think you can already see evidence of interstate annoyances emerging, obviously, in the EU. Ironically, I was speaking with a woman who was from Italy, who was in Ireland as an economic migrant. And she said, there's so many refugees who are showing up here now. She said, in Italy, we just kick the boat over. And so you can see the differences in how much they welcome them, based on which country you're in. So that's a big topic of conversation. The other thing is from a migration standpoint, which is much, much more striking, is Brazilians. Brazilians in Ireland. I saw someone quoted to me a figure, which I have not checked, that there are now 80,000 Brazilians living in Ireland. And I will tell you from just the on-the-ground experience, they're everywhere. And they're all coming in, and they're using this visa scheme where you can work 20 hours a week as long as you're studying. So they're all going there. It's young people. They're studying, and they're working 20 hours a week officially, and then they work the rest of the time under the table because you can't pay the rent on 20 hours a week.
Yeah.
And the number of Brazilians there is absolutely exploding. Everywhere I went, I heard people speaking Portuguese. The people in line behind me at the post office, there's Portuguese or Brazilian grocery stores on every other block in certain areas of Dublin. I went in there and talked with a young woman who was working there. She'd been there only 4 months. She spoke no English, and she's there under the same thing. So really, really interesting development. And from a macro standpoint, one of the things that's plaguing all of these other countries is lack of labor for leisure services, restaurants. This is still a major issue in the U.S. and other countries, not in Ireland, because all of those people are working in the sector and the wages are so good. I talked with a Brazilian who was a bartender at a bar, and he said, I make more money as a bartender here in Dublin than I do as an engineer in Brazil. So I came here. So it's very striking when you think about inflation, when you think about supply and demand of labor, when you think about migration flows. On so many of these issues, Ireland is sort of ground zero. And for that reason, it's really interesting and important to go there and get a feel for what's going on, even though it's such a tiny place.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing about Ireland is that, and this is I really enjoyed writing that in focus piece that you talked about, because I mean, it's just a country that is in the flux of a lot of different change. There are very few moments in history where you can say a country is going through something unprecedented, but Ireland is literally going through something unprecedented. If you go back a millennium plus, they have never had the sort of geopolitical tailwinds that they have in general. But to your point, they also have these issues that they really have to resolve, and housing is chief among them. It's sort of the inheritance of the 2008 financial crisis for Ireland, because I mean, that's my sense of where the housing shortage really begins, because as you point out, you sort of talk about Ireland as the front row for a lot of different developments. They were also front row for that, sort of the 2008 crisis, Ireland was experiencing that 07, 06. So it's interesting that they're having those struggles. And I'm also struck by what you said about just the sentiment turning on migration, because if Ireland is turning against migration, I mean, just think about what the rest of Europe must be feeling about that. And more so than maybe any other political issue, migration is the thing that has gummed up the works of the European Union. Like, I would ascribe Brexit primarily to concerns about migration. If you go back to the initial disagreements between Hungary and Germany, a lot of that you can trace back to migration, at least as the proximate issue. Poland notably has not been that concerned about that, although even there you're starting to get some concerns with the level of Ukrainian migration that has come there in general. So is there anything else you wanted to say about Ireland, Rob, or do you want to move over to Brazil a little bit?
The only thing I would add on Ireland is just from a market's real estate perspective. What's very, very striking, and I think this is similar in other, high-profile cities, is just as there's a shortage of residential real estate, there is a growing surplus of commercial real estate. And that is very obvious when you look at the office sector. Like, all of these companies are building out Class A, major headquarters for themselves, and there's no one in there. I went to the HubSpot, which is a big SaaS company based in Boston, actually, and they just built a big headquarter building right in a very nice part of Dublin. It was a ghost town. They had the chairs stacked up in the common area just to show how little use it gets. So the bigger theme here, I think, of interest is a lot of these companies began these projects pre-COVID. Now they're finishing them up. The amount of super high-end Class A office space hitting the market is really, really high. And this is the case for a place like New York, for example. It's not just a Dublin thing. And lower down in the market, you can just see this is starting to have a major impact because the vacancies in like Class B and Class C commercial real estate are very, very high. And even Class A or Class A minus is notably high. Like, I went and visited a number of buildings that are not brand new buildings, but they're Class A buildings, and they're half empty. The tenants have just left. They have signs showing, which major tenant is on each floor, and 2/3 of the floors have no logos on them. They're just sitting there empty, like in an eerie ghost town way. So when you think about work from home and sort of this trend of the usage of space, which is a major trend just in general, also, Ireland is ground zero on that front, I think, too, because all of the big tech companies want to build out capacity there, and it's happening. So worth thinking about.
As we go from there, though, we'll use your run-in with the Irish Brazilian political refugees to segue into some talking about Brazil. There was a really interesting article this morning on Bloomberg. The title of the article was "Why Brazil is Falling Behind in the Electric Car Transition," and that title by itself, I think, connotes a political bias, and we can talk about that in a second, which is that, if you are building electric vehicles or if you are prioritizing electric vehicles, that is a good thing. And if you're not prioritizing electric vehicles, that's a bad thing. But when you start to dig into some of the data, I mean, the point that the article is making is that Brazil is not really into electric vehicles because they have these flex fuel cars that are designed to switch back and forth between gasoline and biofuels, especially ethanol coming from corn or sugar in particular. And Brazil, 5 centuries of sugar production in Brazil, you can literally go back in time. 5 centuries? Is that too much? I don't know if I have my math right. Literally centuries of sugar production in Brazil, where it's been such an important part of the economy for so long. And the article notes that 84.5% of cars in Brazil flex fuel versus only 0.5% right now with EVs. That's much, much lower, even than in the United States, where we have tons of natural gas and oil and everything else, where it's sort of 7 or 8% right now. Though I wouldn't feel that way. I go around New Orleans, it's like a Tesla every other corner here. I can't quite figure it out. But it's also, Brazil's actually, when it comes to like renewable energy, it's a really good story. 80% of electricity comes from renewables, whether it's hydro or solar or wind or biomass and these other things. And because they have these flex fuel cars and they rely on biomass and biofuels so much, they actually sort of have half the emissions that most normal developed countries have from their combustion vehicles. One stat that stood out to me was, Brazil basically, because they emphasize flex fuel, they basically it's the equivalent of if you shut down 9 coal plants in the United States annually. That's how the level of emissions they're curbing by emphasizing these flex fuel cars. So I don't understand why there's this sort of bias against, they're not doing electric vehicles the way that everybody else is. So obviously they're not doing things that are green. Now, there's something to be said about social cohesion and the fact that all these different industries are there as well. So that was sort of on my mind. And then the other thing was, it's this interesting balancing act, especially for Lula and the Brazilian government, because on the one hand, they're trying to attract Chinese electric vehicle makers and promising them all sorts of incentives for labor, promising them access to lots of metals and minerals that Brazil has for manufacturing in Brazil, while at the same time keeping all of the incentives for flex fuel cars and biofuels and ethanol and things like that. So you're getting the Chinese interest, but you're also trying to continue your interest as well. And then just this dichotomy between different auto companies and how they're thinking about Brazil. So BYD, one of the main Chinese EV makers, they're building a flex fuel car for the Brazilian market, even as they want to build EVs in Brazil in general for export to other markets. Toyota's going in with a flex fuel car. GM sticks out like a sore thumb because they had some top official from their South America division who said, no, Brazil, by 2030, we're going to stop with this biofuel thing and we're going to go full in on EVs, and GM is focusing on EVs. And I don't know, I'll let you riff here in a second. I wanted to bring it up because there's that bias against if you don't do this exact renewable energy technology this exact way, you are somehow falling behind. Like, Bloomberg's not trying to be biased there, but there really is a bias there. And the second is that I talk about the multipolarity of energy all the time and about how we're moving towards a world where different parts of the world are going to have different energy makeups. They're going to rely on different sorts of energy technology. So what's going to work in Brazil is not what's going to work in China, is not what's going to work in Europe or the United States. Whereas for the last 100 years, yes, you could supplement here and there, but it was basically oil, maybe a little bit of natural gas. If you had some renewable sources like Brazil has, you could emphasize them, but it was one sort of global energy economy. And I actually think this story is a great example of how a place like Brazil that has all of these agricultural commodities, they're already producing so many agricultural commodities. They're going to be producing a lot more. They have to do something with them. Why not drive down the price of energy and make things a little cleaner and renewable on that end? So I just thought it was a really interesting dynamic, and I'm always on the lookout for news about electric vehicles, because the more I'm in this space, the more I think this tunnel vision on EVs, I don't understand why it's there, and I don't understand why they've become the symbol of the green energy revolution, because they're not particularly green. But I'll get off my soapbox there, and you tell me if I'm crazy.
No, you're not crazy at all. I mean, there's a lot of places where I want to go with this, because this is this seems like a little subtle thing, but this is a major issue. And here's a few different ways that I think about it, at least, right? So the first is just getting to the bias and the tone of the piece. I think you can make the argument that we're in a sort of S curve when it comes to electric vehicles, because right now the penetration, at least in the U.S., is very low and is just starting to ramp up from very low levels. And so the hype machine has been in full force for at least 2 years. And now we're going to start to see the complexities of EVs. And you can already see there was a piece on Bloomberg today about how a lot of I just almost said marks. I'm turning French. A lot of the brands that sold very, very well last year for EVs are seeing very disappointing sales this year. So some of this is sputtering already and showing some disappointment. So my prediction is we're going to enter sort of the first turn of the S curve where things get difficult. And a lot of this sort of yay, rah, rah, EVs are so obviously the answer will become less obvious. But right now we're in, just media hype mode. It's all speculation, so they can say whatever they want. So that's one point. The second point I would make is Toyota is the smartest car company in the world, full stop. They are far and away the smartest when it comes to harnessing different types of energy. One of the key things that they did so well, and why they rose to such dominance in the 1980s was in integrating the electrical systems of cars, which were becoming more and more and more important, with the mechanical systems of cars, and doing so in a way that was extremely efficient and reliable. They know energy, and Toyota has not gone all in on EVs, as I've said many times. And I think that's the most important thing to just watch, because if they've not gone all in on EVs, it means that the issue is not settled. And, it really is a strong argument in favor of this sort of multipolar view of, hey, different energy sources are going to work better in different places. So watch Toyota and what they do, and forget about what, some Bloomberg journalist says, I guess would be my other point. The third thing that I think is worth thinking about is a lot of this, when you think about multipolarity, when you think about geopolitical issues, coming to the fore here, like a lot of this in the background is about the emergence of China as an EV player. And there's very specific kind of bottom-up industry reasons for this. I've said a few times before, building a car is the hardest thing that a country can do, because it's an engineering challenge of massive proportions, and it's a consumer product. All of the, need to respond to consumer trends, to pivot with tastes, to get the design right, to integrate the design with the actual engineering is a massive challenge, and only a few countries can do it. China never made good cars. China is not Japan. China is not Korea. At least they weren't until fairly recently. They made cars for the Chinese market, and they were okay, but they were not exporting to the United States or to Europe and selling Chinese cars until we started to have the EV emergence really get up steam. And one thing that I think is worth thinking about is we're sort of China's way to get their foot in the door, because an EV car is way simpler than an internal combustion engine car. And the technology is basically one where you can build these platforms, which are not really, from a manufacturing and engineering standpoint, it's a lot easier to build these platforms, and then you iterate with the design on top of it, than it is to have an internal combustion platform and have everything work like a symphony, like clockwork. And if you have one thing go wrong, then you're screwed. So China, in many ways, has built an advantage in EVs because they've thrown a ton of money into battery capacity, into the materials that go into it, into developing the know-how, to creating the batteries and the platforms that go under them, and subsidizing and supporting all of the players. Because remember, you only need a few platforms. It's not that different. And then lots of little players can iterate and be creative and try different designs and business models and approaches and see what works. So you can see this in the West, where like a lot of the Western companies are sort of centralizing on a few platforms, or they're licensing platforms from innovative EV sort of startups and then using them for their bigger fleets. But China has been able to do that. And because it's just so much easier, and it's something China's good at, throw a shit ton of capital at a problem and dominate that area, they've been very successful. And, if you look at how much market share Chinese cars have taken, Chinese EVs, I should say, in Europe in the recent period, and how much they're projected to take in the next 2 years, the numbers are shocking. So part of this, I think, not to go on and on, part of this, I think, is, a little bit fear that, oh my God, EVs are the future, and look how much of a head start China has. We have to respond. And I just think people could look back historically and say that was a massive error based out of, paranoia to some extent. And when you think of how few major decision makers there are at the big U.S. OEMs, Mary Barra and 3 other people, basically, at the end of the day, these companies are so big and the industry is so consolidated, you don't need, that many decision makers to decide they're going all in on EVs, and then the U.S. is going all in on EVs, for better or for worse. So,
have you read The Last Tycoon?
The F. Scott Fitzgerald book, you mean?
No. It's a biography by T.J. Stiles about Cornelius Vanderbilt, who I just started it like this week. I had never heard of Cornelius Vanderbilt, so I have the intro running through my mind right now because I was just listening to it when I was dropping the baby off at her grandmother's house. And it just kind of strikes me as that, because it talks about him being the real, the original robber baron, that you can draw a straight line from, this idea that we have a couple corporate leaders who dominate decision making in the United States, and draw that back to Carnegie and J.P. Morgan, all those others. But really, it's Cornelius Vanderbilt who changes everything and launches American corporate capitalism off on that path where, yes, we have this Republican experiment, but industry is getting consolidated in the hands of just a few people. And I don't know, when you were saying that, it just struck me. But that's also, I think, a pretty good segue into talking about China in a roundabout way. I was going to come to it at the end, but I think it makes sense to come to now, because I'm glad you said that about China, because one thing here is that it seems to me that maybe China has made a mistake of its own in betting the farm on electric vehicles. They probably had a 5-year plan somewhere where they decided China will now become the dominant EV vehicle maker, and they're going for it. And if I'm right about my EV skepticism, there's no country arguably that's going to be worse off if China's thinking they're going to export these EVs abroad rather than just consume them domestically than China. And we might get to this in a second, but we've been looking for and trying to read the tea leaves about whether China is going to try to stimulate the economy from a fiscal point of view, from a consumption point of view. And the National Development and Reform Commission said that they're formulating some policy that's supposed to go towards consumption and recovery. And I'll just read you the translation of what they supposedly are working on. Consumption policies focused on stabilizing consumption, promoting automobile consumption, electronic product consumption, expanding rural consumption, and optimizing the consumption environment. First of all, how many times are you trying to fit the word consumption into a sentence, guys? We get it. Consumption there. You can anyway. But I thought it was pretty notable that automobile consumption is the second one, that you've got these Chinese EV makers who are making all of these EVs, and at least as the National Development Reform Commission is thinking about it, stimulating consumption. The number 2 one on the list in terms of importance is we got to get Chinese people buying EVs. I think that's interesting. The flip side of this also is, we talked about gallium and germanium last week. We're having Tomas on probably next week to talk about some of these things. Everybody's talking about mineral commodities and all the supply chains that China dominates. As you said, they dominate the battery conversation. You cannot scale up EVs in the United States. Let's say you could wave a magic wand and say, okay, everybody has to buy an EV in the next 2 years and trade out their internal combustion engine cars. We couldn't do it. We couldn't do it unless we said to China, hey, forget about the trade war. We're going to need all of these mineral commodities that you dominate all the supply chains with. So even when you're thinking about it from that perspective, it doesn't really work. And the reason I think that that's a good segue also into what I wanted to talk about was that, and I think this is what China's strategy, it's really the only strategy they have right now. There's the Chinese government and there's the U.S. government, and they're locked in this trade war against each other. We can't really speak about Chinese industry, I think, as independent from the Chinese government. At times it wants to be, but the Chinese Communist Party has very clearly brought it to heel over the past couple of years. But U.S. industry is not beholden to what the U.S. government wants. And U.S. industry has no interest in what the U.S. government is doing with China right now. Now, we saw this week with semiconductor companies are putting pressure on the White House to rein in some of these restrictions on chips and artificial intelligence. There's already some initial reports that maybe the Biden White House is going to walk back some of the things that they were going to do because of that. You had the Semiconductor Industry Association, I think I have that name right, but it's the U.S. Semiconductor Industry Association, saying, yes, it's fine that you want to go after China for unfair practices, but if you really go after them too hard, you're going to destroy U.S. semiconductor companies in the process. We need all these supply chains to be open. We need market access. You're going to destroy our ability to make semiconductors at all if you go after China. And I think that, if you look at what China has done in recent months, yes, they're meeting with Blinken and they do the same things, but who did they give a huge, nice, formal dinner to and had pictures of him on the People's Daily and everything else? Is Bill Gates. They're hosting him and saying, come, Bill Gates, our friends, bringing in all their friends from industry and really pushing them to say, hey, can you get the U.S. to stop pushing so hard on us? And I think that's where China really does it's an asymmetric advantage. When you just look at sort of pound for pound, the U.S. has more leverage in the aggregate, but I think China's trying to put pressure on U.S. companies to then go back and put pressure in Washington and say, hey, you can't do all of these things without completely blowing off your own leg. And don't think for a minute that if you go after the big things we're depending on to grow our economy in the next couple of years, fine, we'll cut off the gallium, we'll cut off the germanium. If you're going to cut off our legs, we're at least going to take an ankle from you as well. So there's an interesting triangle there. And I think it's been mostly government to government that we've focused on in the last 6 months or so. But I think you're beginning to see U.S. industry emerge and push back against the White House. On the one hand, U.S. industry is happy to have the CHIPS Act and government support, federal subsidies and dollars. But on the other hand, I think they're staring at the abyss and saying, well, if you do everything you're saying with China, like we're all screwed because globalization, like it's the United States and China, we're the two top dogs. You can't just snap your fingers and unravel that.
My God, there's a lot to get into there.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I had my coffee right before we got on the podcast.
No, you should do this every time. You're nailing it.
Am I? Okay, that's good. I worry that I have the coffee and I start talking too fast, and then I'm going to sound like Ben Shapiro and fuck that guy. So like I try to be careful.
I hate to say it, but I don't even know who that person is.
That's comforting to me. I can't tell you. Every single speech I do, somebody comes up to me and says, hey, are you related to Ben Shapiro? And I always say, no. And as soon as I get big enough that he wants to have me on his show, I will gladly eviscerate him in a debate on a topic of his choosing. I'm happy to show him what real intelligence looks like. Anyway, it's good that you don't know the leading brightest light in conservative media in the United States. Go on.
So back to China. So a few kind of broader points that I would make here. The first one is, if you look historically, the thing to compare the current situation to is the United States in the 1920s. China runs the biggest current account surplus in the world. It runs a current account surplus at a scale that's literally unprecedented in the history of the world, even bigger than the U.S. was running during World War I, when basically they were just making as much stuff as they possibly could and shipping it to Europe, especially agriculture and stuff like that, to feed the war machine. So what happens when you have these huge imbalances? Because it is a huge imbalance. China, they have this surplus because of policies they've enacted, which we're going to get to the consumption thing because this is related to that. When the world goes back into balance or some form of it, which we're trying to get to, like that's why these tensions are building and, all of this stuff is happening. The current account surplus country is the one that gets fucked, for lack of a better term. They are in a position of weakness because they are dependent on outside demand. That's how a current account surplus works. So I think it's a very simple point, but it's the most important thing to keep in mind here is historically, economically, they're coming into this at a huge disadvantage. Getting to the sort of industry and the consumption stuff, part of the industry thing first. So U.S. companies, putting pressure on the government not to do this. I think the problem is China's already backed itself into a corner to some extent. Yes, U.S. companies are saying things publicly. Yes, there's articles in the newspaper about, Intel said this, and Intel's so screwed, I'm not sure they're saying anything. But, NVIDIA said this, or ASML doesn't want this. Like, that's fine. But in aggregate, corporate America doesn't really give a shit that much about getting access to China because, by definition, China has such a surplus. It's just less important to them than getting access to the U.S. is for Chinese companies. So yeah, there are some companies that will have like very specific businesses that are targeted toward China. But if you read what companies are saying, like about 15 years ago, if you read company transcripts on their earnings or their investor days, and they lay out, the tout for investors like us, hey, where's the growth opportunity? Here's the great bold vision of how we're going to triple our EBITDA in 5 years. It's always a story like that. 15 years ago, that was all, China, 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 China. If every one of the 1.2 billion people in China drinks one Starbucks coffee a day, then, we'll make $1 trillion, that kind of thing. You don't hear those stories anymore. People in the corporate world are much more circumspect about China. Their China businesses have not grown very much. They're much more subdued in trying to expand. And yeah, maybe they'll try to protect what business they have there already, because it is a big market no matter what. But as far as that balance goes, I don't think there's enough leverage for them to put on the US. I don't think in aggregate they care too much, aside from some very specific industries or product lines, right?
I'd push back against you a little there, because I think you're right from a consumer product perspective, and maybe you're right about a growth perspective. But for the myriad large companies whose supply chains depend on China at some point in the supply chain, and they can't just flip a switch and all move to Vietnam or India, wherever else they want to overnight. From that kind of supply chain resilience perspective, it really can affect things. And it's not like the answer there is not they're going to say, hey, we want to go back to everything as normal with China. It's more like, hey, we need 5 years, and so don't close down. And after you soften the restrictions a little bit, by the way, we need another 5 CHIPS acts in these different industries in order to kind of process it forward. I would add that little nuance to what you said.
Yeah, no, and that's totally valid. I mean, this isn't black and white. This is talking about sort of aggregates and where things go to over time as the weighing machine goes into effect, not the how we get from here to there. But it does tie into the consumption thing with the China's the statement that you read, which is really interesting, because if you look, they're basically telling you what they're going to do. We want to encourage consumption of electronics, consumption of cars, consumption of this, that, and the other thing, very specific, which means that they're going to target supply side sort of credit oriented stimulus to try to get people to buy those things. Hey, go out and buy a washer and dryer and we'll give you subsidized credit to do it. Or go out and buy a car and we'll give you a special, low rate loan if it's your first car, or, all sorts of things that they do at the margin, which they're trying to do right now to support the housing market. And the problem is none of those things have worked, and none of them are going to work. And if they do pursue them, they make the problem ultimately worse than it was before. Because the problem is not access to credit. The problem is not supply side. The problem is the Chinese economy is way imbalanced, where individual households don't get enough of the income that's going around. So giving them more debt isn't going to help. You need to just write them a check. And the problem is, to write them a check is against the DNA of the Chinese system. It's the DNA of the Chinese system is to compress household consumption and take the surplus and dump it into building EV battery plants, or dump it into, whatever sort of investment priority of the government is. And, I feel like a broken record because I say this all the time, I guess, but that's the biggest question in the world is, are they going to be able to change that system without having some forcible problem, without being forced to do so? And this gets into the local government debt issues and local government restructuring issues that we've talked about recently. But all of this stuff about promoting consumption, it doesn't mean anything unless they're actually going to increase the real incomes of households. And where's the sign that they're doing it? There's really none yet.
Yeah, there's 2 other things I want to read from this spokesperson, or I should say he's the director of the Political Research Office at the National Development and Reform Commission. The first is that he says, promoting consumption is not only the key to the current recovery and expansion of demand, but is also related to better satisfying the people's expectations and yearning for a better life. And I never tire of making this point. It's the Chinese Communist Party, it's the communist authoritarian ogre and things like that. And yet, from the top policy levels here, we're talking about, oh, yes, consumption of automobiles and consumer goods and supporting private industry. This is what is going to provide better expectations and yearnings for better life. Like, there is absolutely nothing communist about that whatsoever. So if you're thinking, like, you do have to think from a Marxist perspective, I think, to think about how the Chinese Communist Party and their leaders think about the world and the vocabulary they use and things like that. But there's nothing communist about this. If there was, they wouldn't be in this problem, because a communist country should be able to redistribute if they were going to. But the other point that you're talking about, and I think this has been one of the more interesting things in the last week or two, everybody's looking for, what's the next stimulus? What's the next measure that they're going to do to try and stimulate the economy? They're cutting interest rates. They're trying to support the yuan. As we're all trying to read the tea leaves and waiting for these plans that they keep talking about and not actually delivering, I think you have seen in the last couple of weeks a tonal shift towards lionizing private industry. And you have the state council coming out and saying, we're going to support private industry in general. You've got this development reform commission I was talking about. They're meeting with private entrepreneurs in local regions to get their input. They're soliciting input on them from, what do you think you need in order to stimulate consumption and things like that. You know who's not in that bucket? Local government officials and bureaucratic provincial officials and things like that. They are the odd ones out. So I think to your real point, I think that what's going on here is that China is trying to build some semblance of private industry. They see that that is the path forward, and they have to de-emphasize the role of the local bureaucrats and the power that they have and everything like that without blowing up the whole system. And this is the second quote that I'll just read from this report. I thought it was really good. He says, China's economy has always been advancing all the way through thorns and obstacles and has continued to develop and grow in overcoming difficulties and challenges. So, like, I feel like China throughout its history, since the People's Republic was founded, it's been one existential challenge after another. And the reason I'm still sort of sanguine that they'll get through it is because they've been through monumental challenges like this. It feels like every 2 decades. And I feel like somehow they're going to figure out the path. But I do think you're right that they're not even close to the real solution here. The real solution here is you're going to have to redistribute wealth somehow. It looks like maybe the eye of Sauron is on the local governments, and they're going to try and do that way. But until you actually get a plan and you actually see Chinese demand increasing, to your point, like, then we're just kicking the can down the road. And I think they're casting about and searching for that and trying to find the way through. And we'll see. The last thing they needed was a U.S. trade war with the U.S., their top customer, on top of it. I mean, in some ways it can help with political messaging and things like that. But and even if you say that U.S. companies are less enamored of the Chinese market in general, I mean, whether it's Biden has rethought his approach on China or anything else, like, we've got the first real signs, whether it's Yellen's visit or Blinken's visit, or now relaxing some of these, what we thought were going to be very, very onerous rules that were going to come out in August. Now they're going to be much less severe, and apparently they're pushed to 2024. Like, the U.S. is showing that maybe it's going to take its foot off the gas pedal. And there's no bigger geopolitical story than if the U.S. is going to do that in the world. So.
I think so here's my prediction on China. You want to hear my big forecast?
Of course.
My big prediction on China is it's just going to become more boring. It's going to become more boring. It's not going to be a crash. There's not, like, if you look at, I mean, historically speaking, right? I'm not just pulling this out of my butt. Like, they're unlikely to have a financial crisis. They're unlikely to have some seminal event like Tiananmen where it's, oh my God, like, there's huge volatility in this society because they've built up too much goodwill over too long of a period. We mentioned this before, like, if you ask any Chinese person under the age of 40, their life so far has been a miracle. The world that they inhabited when they were an adolescent versus the world they inhabit today is incredible. And you can talk about, we don't have good jobs, university graduates graduating, they're complaining. But, like, that is an extremely potent force, and it's very difficult to overestimate how important that is. So yes, they're going to have major issues, and the sort of malinvestment and debt issues are foremost among them. But look at what happened with Japan, right? I think probably we'll have the same playbook, because Japan, if you go back to the 1980s, we were obsessed with Japan. They were the next rising power. I mean, all this. The movie Rising Sun with Michael Douglas, remember? The villains were Japanese businessmen. That was the trope. What was the one with Michael Keaton when he worked in the auto industry? Gung Ho. That, I think I'm aging myself here or dating myself. But anyway, it was a cultural trope. Oh my God, the Japanese were losing our touch. And then it just sort of faded away. And Japan didn't implode. I mean, Japanese asset prices and real estate prices declined 90% over a very extended period of time. But it wasn't a revolution. It wasn't, oh, you woke up one day and there was tanks in the streets. It just got more and more boring as they dealt with their own issues, slowly tried to rebalance things, and they're probably not going to do it in the right way, but, it'll take time. So, I think we're going to wake up 15 years from now and we're going to be in a much more multipolar world where, much more of the space in the Economist magazine is going to be devoted to India and Brazil and Mexico and places like that. And China will be, important, but not like the same way that the US is. You could even make the same argument about the Soviet Union. If the Soviet Union didn't try to reform itself, it would have faded into more and more irrelevance from a global, standpoint as a player. I really believe that, because that's how the Chinese system today is the same as the Japanese system. It's the same as the Soviet system. Alexander Gershon wrote about the Soviets. It's the same thing. Seize capital from households, allocate it. Eventually you spend it on stupid shit and you build up too much debt, and you can't reverse that process. And it takes many, many years to sort of work itself out, as you never really recognize the losses. You just kind of have to sweat them off over an extended period. And as you do so, you become relatively distracted and weak. And I think that's what we're going to see with China.
I think I've already made fun of this on the podcast, but I can't help myself. I'm sure you saw the Goldman Sachs report that India is forecasted to supplant the United States as the world's largest economy in 2075. Thank you, Goldman Sachs, for that really prescient prediction there. The two other things that I just want to say in response to that is, I think you're right about the Japan-style scenario for China, and that's the best case scenario. Like, if they can pull off what Japan did, that will be success for Xi Jinping. And just sort of the last thing, I'm glad you brought up Tiananmen too, because Tiananmen was not about economics. Tiananmen was all about politics and political expression, and the Chinese Communist Party decided they wanted to give sort of more voice to political expression, give people the ability to express themselves more, and then they had to snap back when you got the protest against the Chinese Communist Party. That's not at issue right now. We're not talking about movements of students rising up because they want to say things that they're not allowed to say. To the extent we have any, frustration at all, it's students who want jobs, who are yearning for the better life that the Reform Commission guy says. It's when you start getting the political tone to these things that you really start to worry, and that's just not there. If anything, like the politics of China's stable, and the Chinese Communist Party's done a fairly good job, relatively.
And let me say one thing about that, because this is really important. China knows that. And what I mean is, the thing to watch, the way China will not have that Japan-style scenario is if they try to reform themselves. If Xi Jinping wakes up tomorrow and says, let's try some liberalization, let's try, maybe that'll get us back to growth. Maybe that is the death knell of the Chinese system. But they'll never do it. And here's why: because Xi has studied the Soviet Union. They understand you cannot do glasnost. Glasnost blows you up. And I think you can interpret the Chinese experience in the 1980s in the same way. In the 1980s, things were very much up in the air with regard to where was the system going to go? What was going to be the overall approach? Is it going to be a hardline approach, kind of rooted in Maoism? Is it going to be sort of a more liberal approach? What are we going to do? And there was different factions that each were very powerful and fighting against each other. And that opened the door to uncertainty. It opened the door to potential reform. This is one of the best books, history books that I really like, is a book called 1688, The First Modern Revolution. And it's about the Glorious Revolution in England, which no one knows anything about because people assume it's super boring. But it's actually really fascinating. And it's related to this because the whole thesis of the book is that the Glorious Revolution in 1688 took place because of the same thing. England at that point was deciding, what is our system going to be? Are we going to be an absolutist monarchy like France, or are we going to be a parliamentary driven, more decentralized system like Holland? And that started a revolution. So anyway, what I'm getting at is she and all of the people around him, they're avid students of what went wrong in the Soviet Union. They're avid students of this process. And I would be shocked if at any point, and unless they're absolutely backs to the wall forced to, that they try to introduce reform, change the system, open any daylight to uncertainty. And if that were to happen, I think we have to reevaluate, but it's probably not going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then I think it argues very strongly for sort of the Japanese sort of outcome, which makes for not good copy, but if that's what we're here for.
I'm going to struggle with how to title the podcast because I want it to be the Japanese style thing. But
I think it's BLWWHHW.
Okay, cool. Before we close, just a couple minutes on this because I don't think we stress this enough. I think one of the things that makes us different than other geopolitical macro shops out there is that, yes, we have this podcast. Yes, Rob and I enjoy talking to each other and making strange, nerdy jokes and things like that. But our money's where our mouth is. We're actually managing money here. So I don't just come here and sell speeches and podcasts and books and things like that because I have some hot geopolitical take. And the same with Rob. He doesn't just have some hot take on innovation or some conversation he wants to tell you about with the Irish construction worker and like the whole thing is done. Like, we're long Brazilian equities right now. We're long, when we say these things, like, we really mean them and we're putting them into action. And that gives us, I think, not just a credibility, but like our skin is in the game. We're not just talking about these things. I'm glad it's entertaining for the listeners, but it's not for entertainment primarily. It's actually because, as I said, we have skin in the game. And I just wanted to point out, I did a solo podcast. This is going out on Saturday rather than Friday. So 2 days ago, I did the solo podcast on the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Wheat prices have popped. And then also, we recently put out on the Knowledge Platform, just for our Knowledge Platform subscribers, our views on LNG and natural gas for the rest of the year and why we're feeling relatively bullish. Rob, I just wanted to give you a minute or two to riff on the charts right now, because at least today, on Thursday, July 20th, we are looking pretty smart. I'm sure that at least something will go wrong in one of our trades, but it's been a pretty good run right now, and I thought we would just say both wheat and natural gas looking good, and I just wanted to ask if you saw anything on the charts that was interesting there, or just sort of, okay, so far, very early days here, those theses are playing out.
Well, both of those charts look like they're digging in and beginning a process of reversal. I guess the bigger observation is more procedural. So inevitably what happens, so on the wheat thing, right? We put on the wheat position when wheat was absolutely in the hole. I forget exactly when it was. I have to look at our notes. But
it was early enough in the year that we got stopped out once, and then we had to come back to it because our timing wasn't quite right.
And why is wheat up so much this week? Because of what's happened in the Black Sea, right? We have no idea that was going to happen. And inevitably, when you put on a position and the position goes in your direction, in your favor, the critics will say, well, they just got lucky. They couldn't have known that was going to happen. But, the whole point is you identify these periods where you don't, like, especially with things that are cyclical, like commodities or cyclical stocks, whether they're consumer or commodity related stocks. This is very hard for people to wrap their heads around. But the way you have to do these things is when, as the adage goes, when those who know it best like it least. That's when you should be really interested, because it means if anything goes right, if anything goes in the opposite direction, it's going to be a surprise. So, without going on and on, we didn't know what was going to happen in the Black Sea, but part of our thesis was, hey, our analysis is that, this is the sort of structural background to these events is getting worse. Something is very likely to happen, and the risk reward of being long wheat here in a place where everyone hates it. And I think you mentioned, you spoke with some people, industry contacts of yours, who said like all the other traders hate wheat right now. That's great. It's great for us. Not because we have some information they don't have. They have more information than us, but we have the ability to step back and have that perspective and say, what's the risk reward here? All this, super informed guys hate this thing. Where's the direction it's more likely to skew from here? And for those who are listening who are not, who don't work at Archer Daniels or whatever, and are trying to manage their money or just get a handle on these markets, I think that's a good rule of thumb, because we're not weak experts. You just kind of apply that psychological framework almost, and on average, it plays out.
All right, with that, Rob, we're skipping next week because I'm out. I will see you in 2 weeks' time. Try not to get lonely without me. Maybe you can find a Brazilian in Dublin to have a Guinness with you or something.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.